What if the place where your loved ones go to live out their final years becomes the place where they meet their end in the most horrifying way possible? Tonight, I'm about to share with you 5 true stories from care homes that will make you question everything you thought you knew about these so-called safe havens. These aren't urban legends. These aren't fictional tales. These are real events that happen to real people, and the disturbing truth behind them will haunt you long after this video ends. Before we dive into these bone-chilling accounts, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear involves real victims, real families torn apart, and real monsters disguised as caregivers. If you're easily disturbed, now might be the time to click away. But if you're brave enough to face the darkness that lurks behind closed doors, then stay with me. On a cold February night in 2018, the Willowbrook Care Center in Ohio seemed like any other nursing home. Elderly residents slept peacefully in their beds, trusting that the night staff would keep them safe until morning. But 67-year-old Margaret Chen had no idea that the person assigned to her care that night was about to become her worst nightmare. Margaret had been living at Willowbrook for 3 years after a stroke left her partially paralyzed. She was a former school teacher who loved reading mystery novels and always had a kind word for the staff. Her daughter Sarah visited every weekend, and Margaret would always light up when she saw her walk through the door. But that February night, something was terribly wrong. Around 2 a.m., Margaret pressed her call button. She needed help getting to the bathroom, something that happened regularly due to her condition. The person who responded was someone she'd never seen before, a tall, thin man with cold eyes, who introduced himself as the new night aide, David Brennan. What Margaret didn't know was that David had been fired from his previous job at another care facility for suspected patient abuse. The facility had let him go quietly, without reporting him to authorities. Now he was working the night shift at Willowbrook, and he was about to reveal just how dangerous he truly was. Security footage later showed David entering Margaret's room at 2:15 a.m. But instead of helping her to the bathroom, something horrific happened behind that closed door. Margaret's muffled screams were barely audible through the thin walls, but her roommate, 82-year-old Helen, heard every terrifying second. Helen was too weak to get out of bed, too frightened to press her own call button. She could only lie there in the darkness, listening as David did unspeakable things to Margaret. The sounds she described to investigators later were so disturbing that 2 detectives had to leave the room during her testimony. When the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m., they found Margaret unconscious in her bed. She had severe bruising around her neck, broken ribs, and injuries that medical examiners later said were consistent with prolonged torture. She died 3 days later in the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. David had vanished before the morning shift arrived. Security cameras showed him calmly walking out of the building at 5:30 a.m., carrying a small bag that investigators believe contained his souvenirs from that night. But the most chilling part? This wasn't his first victim. When police finally tracked David down 2 weeks later, they discovered he had worked at 7 different care facilities over the past 5 years. At each location, there had been unexplained deaths during his shifts. Elderly residents who were stable one day, dead the next. Always during the night shift. Always when David was working. Margaret's daughter Sarah had to identify her mother's body. She told reporters that her mother's face was so badly damaged that she almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had raised her, who had taught hundreds of children, who had lived through 67 years of life's ups and downs, had her final moments filled with unimaginable terror. David was eventually caught hiding in a motel room 3 states away. In his possession, police found detailed journals describing what he called his experiments on elderly patients. The entries were so graphic that parts of them were never released to the public. He's now serving life in prison, but the families of his victims say no punishment could ever be enough. The Willowbrook Care Center was shut down 6 months later. The building still stands empty today, and locals say you can sometimes see lights moving through the windows at night, even though the power was cut years ago. Golden Years Manor in rural Pennsylvania was supposed to be a place where families could trust their elderly loved ones would be well cared for. The facility had an excellent reputation, modern amenities, and a staff that seemed genuinely caring. But in the summer of 2019, family members started noticing something that would uncover one of the most disturbing scandals in care home history. It started when Robert Martinez went to visit his 79-year-old father, Eduardo. Eduardo had been living at Golden Years for 6 months, and Robert visited every Tuesday like clockwork. But when he arrived for his weekly visit in July, the staff told him something that made his blood run cold. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martinez, but your father is no longer with us." Robert assumed the worst, that his father had passed away. But when he asked for details, the staff member looked confused. "Oh no, sir, he's not dead. He just isn't here anymore. He was transferred to another facility." But Robert had never authorized any transfer. He had never even been contacted about one. When he demanded to see the transfer paperwork, the staff couldn't produce it. When he asked which facility his father had been transferred to, they couldn't answer that either. Robert immediately called the police. But what they discovered was far worse than a simple administrative error. Eduardo Martinez wasn't the only resident who had mysteriously transferred from Golden Years Manor. Over the past year, 17 elderly residents had allegedly been moved to other facilities, but there was no record of where they had gone. The investigation revealed a horrifying pattern. The residents who disappeared all had one thing in common: NBS. They had no close family members who visited regularly. They were the forgotten ones, the elderly people whose families lived far away or had stopped visiting altogether. Detective Lisa Morgan was assigned to the case. She told reporters that in her 20 years of police work, she had never seen anything quite like this. As they dug deeper, they discovered that the missing residents' Social Security and Medicare payments were still being processed and sent to Golden Years Manor, even though the residents were nowhere to be found. The administrator of the facility, Martha Kellerman, initially claimed that all the transfers were legitimate and that the paperwork had been mislaid due to a computer system upgrade. But when investigators pressed harder, her story began to fall apart. Security footage from the facility told a different story. Late-night video showed several residents being wheeled out of the building in the middle of the night, not in medical transport vehicles, but in unmarked vans. The residents appeared to be unconscious or heavily sedated. The most chilling footage showed 84-year-old Dorothy Banks being loaded into one of these vans. Dorothy had mild dementia, but was otherwise healthy. Her nephew lived in California and hadn't visited in over a year. In the security video, Dorothy appeared to be awake, but unable to move or speak, her eyes wide with terror as she was loaded into the vehicle. Where were these elderly people being taken? That question haunted investigators for months. The break in the case came when a maintenance worker at abandoned warehouse 20 miles from Golden Years came forward with information that made everyone's worst fears come true. He had been hired to clean out the old building and had discovered what he first thought was medical equipment left behind by a previous tenant. But looking closer, he realized it was something much more sinister. The warehouse contained dozens of hospital beds, all stained with bodily fluids. There were restraints attached to each bed, and the concrete floor was covered with what appeared to be dried blood. But most disturbing of all were the personal belongings scattered throughout the warehouse. Dentures, hearing aids, wedding rings, family photos, verse. All the precious items that elderly people hold on to in their final years. DNA testing confirmed that these belongings had belonged to the missing residents of Golden Years Manor. Martha Kellerman and 3 staff members were arrested on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and murder. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a systematic operation designed to steal from the elderly and dispose of them when they were no longer useful. The residents had been taken to the warehouse, where they were kept in horrific conditions until they died from neglect, malnutrition, or worse. Their deaths were never reported, and their benefits continued to be collected by the care home. Of the 17 missing residents, only 5 bodies were ever recovered from various locations around the county. The others remain missing to this day. Families were left not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, not knowing if they suffered, not knowing if they called out for help in their final moments. Robert Martinez still drives by the abandoned Golden Years Manor building sometimes. He told a local reporter that he keeps hoping to see his father's face in one of the windows, hoping that somehow this is all just a nightmare and Eduardo is still alive somewhere, waiting to be rescued. The warehouse has been demolished, but locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of crying coming from the empty lot where it once stood. Sunset Gardens Care Home in Florida was known for its beautiful courtyard and peaceful atmosphere. Families felt good about placing their loved ones there, trusting that the medical staff would provide the best possible care. But in 2020, one family's routine visit would expose a medical horror story that shocked the entire state. Janet Richardson was visiting her 72-year-old mother Beverly on a sunny Thursday afternoon in March. Beverly had been living at Sunset Gardens for 2 years while recovering from hip surgery. She was expected to regain most of her mobility and possibly even return home someday. But when Janet arrived that day, she was shocked by what she saw. Her mother, who had been alert and talkative during her last visit just 3 days earlier, was now completely unresponsive. Beverly lay in bed with her eyes open, but staring blankly at the ceiling. When Janet called her name, there was no recognition, no response at all. Janet immediately asked to speak with her mother's nurse, a woman named Carol Stevens, who had been working at the facility for over a year. Carol explained that Beverly had been having behavioral issues and that the doctor had prescribed new medication to help keep her calm. But Janet knew her mother well. Beverly had never had behavioral problems in her entire life. She was gentle, kind, and cooperative with all medical procedures. Something wasn't right. That's when Janet noticed something that made her stomach turn. In her mother's nightstand drawer, she found bottles and bottles of prescription medications. Some were partially full, others completely empty, but all of them were labeled with different residents' names. There were powerful painkillers, sedatives, antipsychotic drugs, and medications that Janet had never heard of. When she confronted Carol about the medication bottles, the nurse's reaction was immediate and suspicious. Carol became defensive, claiming the medications had been left there by mistake and that she would remove them right away. But Janet had already taken photos with her phone. That night, Janet couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her mother's vacant stare and all those medication bottles. The next morning, she arrived at Sunset Gardens early and positioned herself where she could observe the medication distribution process without being noticed. What she witnessed was beyond horrifying. Carol was systematically giving residents medications that weren't prescribed to them. She would take pills from one resident's bottle and give them to another. She mixed medications together in ways that Janet knew couldn't possibly be safe. Most disturbing of all, She was giving some residents multiple doses of powerful sedatives, far more than any doctor would ever prescribe. Janet watched in horror as Carol approached an 89-year-old man named Arthur who was sitting peacefully in the common room reading a newspaper. Carol forced him to take a handful of pills, and within minutes, Arthur's head began to droop. Soon he was unconscious in his chair. Janet immediately called 911 and demanded that her mother be taken to the hospital for blood tests. The results were terrifying. Beverly had dangerous levels of at least 6 different medications in her system, including drugs that should never be given together. The combination could have easily killed her. The police investigation revealed that Carol Stevens had been conducting what investigators called human experiments on the elderly residents. She had been mixing different drug combinations to see what effects they would have. Some residents became catatonic. Others experienced seizures. Several died. Carol's own notes, found in her apartment, described the residents like laboratory animals. She wrote detailed observations about how different drugs affected their behavior, their vital signs, and their level of consciousness. She seemed particularly interested in finding combinations that would keep residents completely sedated but still technically alive. The most chilling entry in her notebook read, Subject 23. Arthur responded well to the new combination. No awareness, no resistance, minimal life signs. Perfect for long-term storage. During the investigation, medical examiners reviewed the deaths of 12 residents who had died while under Carol's care over the previous 18 months. All of them had unexplained drug toxicity in their systems. All of them had died during Carol's shifts. One victim was 77-year-old Grace Wilson, a former librarian who had been recovering from a minor stroke. Grace's daughter had noticed that her mother seemed increasingly confused and lethargic during visits, but the staff assured her it was normal for stroke patients. Grace died in her sleep on a Tuesday night, and her death was attributed to heart failure. But the toxicology report told a different story. Grace had been given massive doses of psychiatric medications that she was never prescribed. The combination had slowly poisoned her over the course of weeks. Her final days were likely filled with confusion, hallucinations, and terror as her brain was systematically destroyed by the chemical cocktail Carol had been forcing her to take. Carol Stevens was arrested and charged with 12 counts of murder and dozens of counts of elder abuse. During her trial, family members described watching their loved ones deteriorate for no medical reason, being told it was normal aging while Carol was slowly poisoning them. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Arthur's son, who said his father had gone from being an active, intelligent man to a vegetative state in just 3 months. She stole his mind before she tried to steal his life, he told the court. Carol was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the damage she caused extends far beyond her victims. The families of the 12 residents who died will never know if their loved ones suffered, if they were aware of what was happening to them, or if they tried to ask for help but couldn't communicate because of the drugs. Beverly Richardson survived, but she never fully recovered. The medications damaged her brain in ways that doctors say are permanent. She now lives in a different facility, and while she recognizes her daughter Janet, she often asks why she feels so confused and why she can't remember things like she used to. Janet visits her mother every day, and she says the hardest part is seeing the occasional moment of clarity in her mother's eyes, when Beverly seems to understand that something terrible happened to her but can't quite remember what. Meadowbrook Assisted Living in Oregon had been operating for over 15 years without any major incidents. It was a small facility with only 40 residents, and the tight-knit staff prided themselves on creating a family atmosphere. But in the fall of 2021, a new hire would turn this peaceful place into a scene from a nightmare. Rebecca Walsh was hired as a night custodian in September. She was quiet, efficient, and seemed perfect for the job. The elderly residents rarely saw her since she worked while they slept, but the day staff appreciated how clean everything was when they arrived each morning. Rebecca worked alone during the overnight shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and for the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. But then residents started complaining about strange sounds during the night. 85-year-old Thomas Barrett was the first to mention it. He told his nurse that he'd been hearing what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor above his room, followed by what he described as someone crying for help. The nurse assured him it was probably just Rebecca doing her cleaning duties, but Thomas insisted this was different. "It sounds like someone's in pain," he said, "and it happens every night around 3 a.m. Soon, other residents were reporting similar disturbances. Mary Peterson, who lived in room 15, said she heard what sounded like muffled screaming coming from the storage room across the hall. Frank Morrison complained about hearing thumping sounds that went on for hours, always in the middle of the night. The day staff initially dismissed these complaints, assuming the elderly residents were having nightmares or experiencing confusion common in their age group. But when multiple residents began asking to be moved to different rooms, the facility's director, Linda Hayes, decided to investigate. Linda decided to stay overnight to observe what might be causing these disturbances. She positioned herself in the administrative office, where she could monitor the hallways through security cameras and listen for any unusual sounds. At first, everything seemed normal. Rebecca arrived for her shift at 11 p.m., clocked in, and began her routine cleaning duties. But around midnight, Linda noticed something odd. Rebecca wheeled a large laundry cart to the elevator and took it up to the second floor, even though there were no laundry facilities on that floor. About an hour later, Rebecca returned with the same cart, but now it appeared to be much heavier. She struggled to push it, and Linda could see her wiping sweat from her forehead as she loaded it onto the elevator. But the most disturbing thing Linda witnessed happened at 3 a.m., exactly when the residents said they heard the crying sounds. Rebecca disappeared into the storage room on the second floor, and shortly after, Linda heard what could only be described as muffled sobbing echoing through the building's ventilation system. The sobbing went on for nearly an hour, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to barely audible whimpers. Linda tried to locate exactly where the sound was coming from, but the building's old ventilation system carried sound in strange ways. When Linda confronted Rebecca the next morning, the custodian claimed she hadn't heard any unusual sounds and had no idea what might be causing the residents' complaints. But Linda noticed that Rebecca seemed nervous, and her uniform had what appeared to be bloodstains on the sleeves. Linda immediately called the police. When officers arrived to search the facility, they focused on the second-floor storage room where Linda had seen Rebecca go the night before. What they found inside will haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. The storage room had been converted into what investigators later described as a torture chamber. Medical equipment that had been reported as broken or missing was arranged in the center of the room. IV stands, oxygen tanks, and hospital beds had been set up in a configuration that served no legitimate medical purpose. But most horrifying were the restraints. Heavy-duty straps had been bolted to the floor, walls, and ceiling. There were bloodstains on the concrete floor and scratch marks on the walls that looked like they had been made by fingernails. In a locked cabinet, police found dozens of syringes filled with various substances, including what forensic testing later revealed to be combinations of cleaning chemicals and stolen medications. There were also detailed notes describing what Rebecca called her research into pain tolerance in elderly subjects. The investigation revealed that over the past 2 months, Rebecca had been selecting residents who were heavily medicated or suffering from dementia, ingressed, people who wouldn't be believed if they tried to report what was happening to them. She would enter their rooms in the middle of the night, sedate them with injections, and then transport them to her makeshift laboratory on the second floor. What she did to them there was beyond comprehension. The evidence suggested she was conducting experiments to see how much pain elderly people could endure before losing consciousness. Her notes contained detailed descriptions of different torture methods and how long each victim remained conscious during the procedures. The most chilling discovery was a video camera that Rebecca had been using to record her activities. The footage was so disturbing that only 3 investigators were ever allowed to view it. One of them, Detective Mike Sullivan, retired from the police force immediately after seeing the videos and has never spoken publicly about what they contained. Rebecca had been careful to target residents who were already close to death or who suffered from conditions that made them unreliable witnesses. When her victims died from their injuries, she would return their bodies to their rooms and stage the scenes to look like natural deaths. The facility's doctor, who only visited once a week, never suspected anything unusual. During the investigation, medical examiners reviewed the deaths of 6 residents who had died during Rebecca's employment. All of them showed signs of trauma that had been missed during the initial examinations. Broken bones, internal bleeding, and evidence of prolonged torture had been attributed to the natural dying process. One victim was 82-year-old Helen Rodriguez, who had moderate Alzheimer's disease. Helen's daughter had noticed that her mother seemed increasingly frightened during visits and would cry whenever she saw someone in a custodial uniform. Helen tried to communicate about bad things happening at night, but her family assumed it was confusion related to her dementia. Helen died what appeared to be a peaceful death in her sleep, but the re-examination of her body revealed multiple fractures, internal injuries, and evidence that she had been chemically tortured over several weeks. Her final weeks of life had been filled with unimaginable suffering that she couldn't communicate to anyone. Rebecca Walsh was arrested and charged with 6 counts of murder and multiple counts of elder abuse and torture. During her psychological evaluation, she told doctors that she had always been curious about death and pain, and that elderly people in care facilities were perfect subjects because no one would believe them if they complained. The trial lasted 6 months, and the testimony was so disturbing that several jury members had to receive counseling. Rebecca was sentenced to death, but she showed no remorse during the sentencing hearing. Her only statement was that she wished she had been able to complete her research. Meadowbrook Assisted Living was permanently closed after Rebecca's arrest. The building was demolished 6 months later, but construction workers reported hearing unexplained sounds during the demolition, sounds that they described as crying and pleading for help. The families of Rebecca's victims filed wrong suits against the facility, but no amount of money could undo the horror their loved ones had endured. The most tragic aspect of the case is that some of the victims tried to tell their families what was happening to them, but their reports were dismissed as confusion or nightmares. Linda Hayes, the facility director, never worked in elder care again. She told investigators that she still wakes up in the middle of the night when she hears any unusual sounds, and she's haunted by the thought of how many nights her residents suffered while she slept peacefully at home. Harmony Hills Care Center in Michigan seemed like an ideal place for families to entrust their elderly loved ones. The facility was modern, well-staffed, and had an excellent reputation in the community. But in early 2022, a routine maintenance call would uncover a secret that had been hidden for years, revealing one of the most disturbing cases of systematic elder abuse ever documented. The discovery began when a plumber was called to investigate a persistent sewage smell coming from the facility's basement level. The maintenance staff had been unable to locate the source of the odor, and residents and visitors were starting to complain. What the plumber found would expose a horror that had been happening right under everyone's feet. While checking the basement pipes, the plumber, Mike Torino, noticed that one section of the basement appeared to be sealed off. There was a door that had been painted over multiple times and appeared to have been unused for years. But the sewage smell was strongest near this door, and Mike could hear what sounded like water dripping inside. When Mike asked the facility administrator, Dr. Patricia Holbrook, about the room, she claimed it was just old storage space that had been sealed off due to flooding issues years earlier. But Mike noticed that Dr. Holbrook seemed nervous about his questions and insisted that the plumbing problem was probably located elsewhere. Mike's instincts told him something wasn't right. The smell wasn't typical of a plumbing problem. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposition. As a former military medic, Mike had encountered that smell before, and he knew what it meant. That evening, Mike called the local police and reported his suspicions. When officers arrived the next day with a search warrant, Dr. Holbrook initially refused to provide keys to the sealed room, claiming they had been lost years ago. Officers had to break down the door. What they found inside defies human comprehension. The room contained 12 hospital beds, all occupied by elderly residents in various stages of malnutrition and decay. Some were still alive but barely conscious. Others had clearly been dead for weeks or even months. The living residents were restrained to their beds and appeared to have been abandoned without food, water, or medical care. The conditions were indescribable. The floors were covered in human waste, rotting food, and bodily fluids. The smell was so overwhelming that several officers had to leave the scene to vomit. Those residents who were still alive were so emaciated that they looked like skeletons with skin stretched over their bones. But the most horrifying discovery was the medical equipment in the room. IV lines had been set up to deliver what appeared to be salt water instead of proper nutrition, deliberately prolonging the residents' suffering while slowly starving them to death. Feeding tubes had been inserted but were connected to nothing, creating the appearance of medical care while providing none. The investigation revealed that this hidden room had been Dr. Holbrook's solution to what she called the problem of residents with expensive medical needs and no family oversight. When elderly residents required costly care that ate into the facility's profits, they were quietly moved to this basement prison and left to die slowly while the facility continued to collect their Social Security and Medicare payments. Detective Sarah Martinez, who led the investigation, later testified that in her 15 years of police work, she had never encountered anything as systematically cruel as what they found in that basement room. The evidence suggested that Dr. Holbrook had been operating this death chamber for at least 3 years. The residents found alive in the room were immediately transported to the hospital, but the damage done to their bodies and minds was irreversible. Most were suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected bed sores, and psychological trauma. Several died within days of being rescued, their bodies too damaged to recover. One survivor was 79-year-old Robert Chen, who had been placed in the basement room 8 months earlier after developing complications from diabetes that required expensive treatment. Robert's family lived across the country and had been told that he was doing well, receiving regular updates and even falsified medical reports. When Robert was found, he weighed only 89 pounds and could barely speak. But he was conscious enough to tell investigators that Dr. Holbrook had visited the room regularly, not to provide care, but to watch the residents suffer. According to Robert, she would sometimes bring a chair and sit in the room for hours, observing the dying residents like they were specimens in an experiment. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Margaret Foster, an 84-year-old woman who had been in the basement for 6 months. Margaret told investigators that she had tried to call for help countless times, screaming until her voice was gone, but the basement room was soundproofed and no one could hear them. Margaret described watching the person in the bed next to her die over the course of several weeks, begging for water that never came. She said the worst part wasn't the physical suffering, but the mental torture of knowing that their families thought they were being well cared for while they were actually being murdered. The investigation uncovered evidence that Dr. Holbrook had been falsifying death certificates for the residents who died in the basement room. Instead of reporting their actual deaths, she would move their bodies back to regular rooms and claim they had died peacefully in their sleep from natural causes. Meanwhile, she continued to collect thousands of dollars in monthly payments for each deceased resident. Financial records showed that Dr. Aide Holbrook had been stealing over $50,000 per month through this scheme. Money that should have been used for the residents' care but instead went into her personal bank accounts. She had used this stolen money to buy luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and a vacation home in Florida. But the financial crimes paled in comparison to the human suffering she had caused. During the trial, family members testified about their final visits with loved ones who had been secretly moved to the basement. They described how their relatives seemed frightened and tried to communicate something urgent, but were dismissed by staff as being confused or having dementia episodes. The prosecution presented evidence that Dr. Holbrook had specifically targeted residents who had cognitive impairments or whose families lived far away. She calculated that these residents could disappear into her basement prison without anyone asking too many questions. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a notebook found in Dr. Holbrook's office that contained detailed financial calculations showing how much money the facility would save by eliminating expensive residents. Next to each resident's name, she had written notes about their medical costs and family situation, essentially scoring them on how profitable their deaths would be. Dr. Patricia Holbrook was convicted on 12 counts of murder, numerous counts of elder abuse, fraud, and theft. She was sentenced to 12 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During her sentencing hearing, she showed no emotion and offered no apology to the families of her victims. The Harmony Hills Care Center was permanently shut down and demolished. The basement room was filled with concrete before the building was torn down, but city records show that construction workers reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from beneath the foundation during the demolition process. The families of Dr. Saul Holbrook's victims have struggled to cope with the knowledge that their loved ones spent their final months in unimaginable suffering, while they believed those same loved ones were receiving compassionate care. Many have expressed guilt that they didn't visit more often or ask more questions about their relatives' treatment. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case is how long it continued without detection. For 3 years, elderly residents were systematically tortured and murdered in that basement room, while the facility maintained its excellent reputation in the community. Dr. Holbrook received awards for her compassionate care of the elderly, even as she was operating what investigators called a death factory in her own basement. The case has led to major changes in how care facilities are inspected and monitored, but for the families of the victims, no policy changes can undo the horror their loved ones endured, or answer the haunting question of how many other facilities might be hiding similar secrets. These 5 stories represent just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the horrors that can lurk within the walls of care facilities. Behind the cheerful brochures and compassionate mission statements, there are monsters who see vulnerable elderly people not as human beings deserving of dignity and care, but as opportunities for profit, control, or worse. The victims in these stories trusted that they would be safe in their final years. Their families trusted that the people they were paying to care for their loved ones would treat them with compassion and respect. Instead, they encountered evil in its purest form, perpetrated by individuals who exploited the most vulnerable members of our society. What makes these stories even more terrifying is how easily they could have continued indefinitely if not for chance discoveries and the bravery of individuals who spoke up when something didn't seem right. How many other care facilities are hiding similar secrets? How many elderly residents are suffering in silence right now, unable to communicate their terror to the outside world? The next time you visit a loved one in a care facility, pay attention to things that seem out of place. Listen when they try to tell you something that doesn't sound right. even if they have dementia or other cognitive impairments. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. The lives of some of the most vulnerable people in our society may depend on it. Remember the names of the victims in these stories. Remember Margaret Chen, who trusted her night aide and paid with her life. Remember Eduardo Martinez and the 16 other residents who simply vanished without a trace. Remember Beverly Richardson, whose mind was destroyed by a nurse's twisted experiments. Remember Helen Rodriguez, who tried to warn her family but wasn't believed. Remember Robert Chen and Margaret Foster, who survived months of torture that no human being should ever endure. Their stories serve as a warning and a reminder that evil can hide behind the mask of compassion, and that sometimes the people we trust most with our vulnerable loved ones are the ones capable of the most unimaginable cruelty. The darkness doesn't end when the lights come back on. In care facilities around the world, the night shift is just beginning, and for some residents, it may be their last. These were real people, real families, real monsters, and somewhere out there, in facilities we pass by every day, it could be happening again. Sweet dreams. If these stories made your skin crawl, like the video. It tells the algorithm you survived. Subscribe and turn on the bell. We drop new nightmares regularly. Share with someone brave, or someone who thinks they are. Comment below. We want to know what you would have done. Some stories don't end when the lights come on. This is Dread Dynasty. We'll see you in the next scare.